So that was testy after that one. My name's Jack McFadden. I was in the Army. Went in May of 1965. Got out the last day of January 1968. I was with Special Forces, um, and I spent the last 11 or 12 months of that time period in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces. I ended up being drafted 3 times. Um, what I decided I wanted, what you used to do back then is you would call the draft board, you could call the draft board, and ask them what age were they taking, right? So I called the draft board in around February of '65 and asked them, what age were they taking, and they told me at that point they were taking um, 21 in 3 months, right? So I was about to turn 21, and 4 months out, and it looked like I was going to get drafted in June, something like that. And I'd end up, everybody was going to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and that was an awfully hot and sweaty place, and I didn't want to end up spending June, July, and August down there. So I told them I wanted to volunteer for that. I went down to the draft board and I volunteered for the draft, but I volunteered to go in the April draft, right? So this was February. This was the end of February when I did it, right? Well, then it came time, or it was in sometime in February. Well, it came time for them to send the notices out for March, and I got drafted by mistake in March instead of April. So I called them up and said, I'm supposed to be drafted in April. You sent me a notice for March. And they said, oh, okay. We'll send you another one next month. Just disregard that. And I think of that, I just imagine today having somebody from the government tell you, well, disregard that draft notice. We'll send you another one next month, right? So, sure enough, they sent me another one the next month. And then, ironically, a couple friends of mine threw a going away party for me. And after the going away party, we got in an automobile accident, and I screwed up one of my legs, so I had an injury from that. So when I went down to get drafted in April, um, they they delayed my draft for another month. So I ended up going again. They sent me another notice somewhere in my records. I have 3 different draft notices. So I ended up going in May. So it wasn't any big surprise when I finally left. I'd quit my job to take a couple weeks off and go in April, and I had about 6 weeks off by the time I went in May. So I was ready to go. I was anxious to go. And back then it was just a way of life. Everybody knew that you didn't have any choices about it. Everybody was going in the military. 65 to 67. The entire country was, I wouldn't say pro-war, but they were supportive of the Vietnam War. And, we used to go out, and when we'd come home for a weekend, you'd get a ride out to Route 301, because 301 and 95 were the East Coast route to come north back then. That was while they were building 95. But you'd hitchhike home, and people would, love to pick you up. They'd pick you up, buy you dinner on the way up, and the whole bit. So, well, basic training. The hardest part of it for me back then, I guess, was some of the physical stuff. The only thing I had a problem with physically was the parallel bars. I just took me a couple of weeks to get the swing of those things. There was a group of us who had volunteered for airborne, right? So Special Forces approached the people who had volunteered for airborne to get them to volunteer for Special Forces. So we volunteered at that point. Right. And then when we went through jump school, I had to take at jump school, I had to take we had to take a qualification test for Special Forces. So then, after we passed that, then our orders right out of jump school were to go to Special Forces Training Group. I went to training group. I got there in the middle of October '65, and we graduated in the middle of June '66. And then I was assigned to the 7th Special Forces Group, and I was there from June of '66 until January of '77, when I left the 7th to go to the 5th in Vietnam. My training was in communications, Morse code communications primarily. That's what most of the training was, because that's, learning Morse code was the most difficult part of it, because you have to get to a point where you hear the letter as a sound and you stop counting dits and das is what you have to do. So then at that point it becomes livable to sit there and listen to it for a couple hours. So we went on some charter outfit called Transcontinental, and everybody else except for us went over on jets. We went over on a 4-engine prop, and it was called a Super Constellation or something. So what was it was probably an 18 to 20 hour flight. Normally, for people leaving Oakland, you'd leave Oakland, you'd stop at Hawaii, and then you go from Hawaii to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And there, for everybody going into Vietnam, they gave them a steak dinner, right? And then you flew from Clark Air Force Base into Vietnam. But for us, since we were on a prop, we went from Oakland to Hawaii, to Wake, to Guam, then to the Philippines, and then into Vietnam. And it ended up it was 44 hours in the air, right? And we went through something like 4 crews on the aircraft. So, but we got to see Wake and Guam. We got to Guam, and that was where the B-52s were flying out of. They were doing the carpet bombing in Vietnam back then. So it was kind of amazing. It was kind of amazing, but it was also kind of sobering, because you got to see the aircraft that were actually flying back and forth every night. When we flew in, we got there at night, so you really didn't get to see anything of it. And then the next morning, we spent the night at the reception center there at Long Bin, I think is where we flew into. And we got up the next morning, and that was just Long Bin was just a big tent city, I think. Then the next day we flew out pretty quickly, and we went to Nha Trang, which is where Special Forces headquarters was. So, and then, then basically we were back under the wing of Special Forces, and we weren't traveling in the regular mass of Army personnel that were going over. And Nha Trang was a pretty nice place. That was a nice compound. But all we ever saw really until we got to our first duty station was the inside of the different compounds that we were in, like Nha Trang. We didn't leave. We were there for a few days, a couple days anyway. while we were issued weapons and equipment and all that. And then we were assigned to different places. I was assigned to Quinyon. I was B detachment, detachment B-22 in Quinyon. And that's where I spent my first 3 months in country there. We used to work, I think we worked 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 8 hours on, 32 hours off, something like that. So, and you work a graveyard shift, followed by a mid shift, followed by a day shift, and then you had 30 or 32 hours, whatever it worked out to, you had off. So, so when you were sitting there in the middle of the night and there's absolutely nothing going on the radio, then you could practice Morse code, sending it and all that. So that's what allowed you to learn so well. And plus you got you had so much traffic. We had about 8 or 9 A teams out there that we were copying traffic from every day, and that volume of traffic, having to do that in a B team, makes you pretty good at copying, and just get pretty proficient at it working B team. So, Special Forces now has regiments and battalions, right? Back at that time, you had a group, right? So the 5th Special Forces was a group, in the same way the 7th was a group, right? And you had a group headquarters, which was called SFOB, Special Forces Operation Base, right? In Vietnam, the SFOB for the 5th group was Nha Trang, right? And Nha Trang had 4 or 5 C teams reporting to it. But Vietnam was broken up into 4 different corps. I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps. It was called I Corps because they used Roman numerals. All right. So, there was one company of Special Forces that was assigned to each of the corps. So, Pleiku was the corps headquarters for 2 Corps. Right? So, that's where the C team was. So, C2 for, C2. C2, C. It was called C2, all right? It was actually Company B of Special Forces, all right? And then under the C team, you had B teams. So it's kind of like a regional district type of breakdown. Like you would have region headquarters was in Pleiku, and then there were 3 district offices. One was in Quinyon, one was in Bami Tuat, and one was in Khartoum or Khartoum. It was called Khartoum, I think. And they were B teams. And then the B teams would have 8 to 10 A teams reporting into the B team. So, and as you went down from C team to B team to A team, the number of people that were assigned decreased. So you had, theoretically, you had 12 people in an A team. You had about 28 or 30 people in a B team. These are American Special Forces in a B team. And in the C team, you probably had 50 American Special Forces assigned there. Now, all the troops that we had were not American troops. They were all foreign troops. Were indigenous troops. They lived there. Right? So, um, because Vinton was in the Central Highlands, it was right on the eastern edge of the Central Highland. Um, we had mountain yards, or mountain yards, or whatever the French was for it. We just called them yards. We had some yards. We had probably about half of the troops that we had in camp were yards. May of '67, I went out to A228 in Vinton to go out on a field operation there, and that was, I guess that was where I actually got my first baptism. Got shot at for the first time. Shot at and missed. So, from there, I was assigned to the Mike Force in Plate Coup. And the Mike Force is, Mike is phonetic for M in the phonetic alphabet. So, what it stood for was, the Mike Force was the Mobile Guerrilla Strike Force, and it was basically it was a Special Forces reaction force. It was run by Special Forces. It was part of the C team, which was in Plate Coup, and it was about, I guess it was about, battalion size or better, and it was all mountain yard troops that were assigned there. It was a week to 10 days we go out for. Yeah. Probably, most of them were probably a week. Yeah. And you just, you just go out in an area you were going to go out and recon. It was pretty much, they were all classified as search and destroy missions, because that's what General Westmoreland wanted them all to be called. So they were all called search and destroy missions. Right? But when you have a company, you have a company of troops that you go out with, and you run into an NVA battalion, the idea of destroying it is no longer in the picture. So it got very noisy very fast. Yeah, you just hear a lot of shooting. I mean, the first time that we ran into contact with, we had an ambush out, and there was a North Vietnamese battalion that was infiltrating, right? And they came walking down the trail, and we had an ambush of mountain yards out along the trail, and they opened fire. Our mountain yards opened fire, and the NVA fled back, and then we kind of departed from that. Once we found out it was a battalion, we weren't going to stand there toe to toe with the battalion in North Vietnamese. So we just reported the movement of that battalion. And, unfortunately, sometimes we walked into the ambush, right? At which time it seemed a lot noisier than the other ambushes. Well, my job was to, when we got into contact, your first job is you react to the ambush, and since we were carrying M16s and they were fully automatic at the time, you would just empty your weapon in the general direction of the ambush, just to return, for the psychological effect of returning automatic fire, right? Just to scare the bejesus out of the other guys. And then And then if it was a continued, any kind of a continued contact, or if we saw another opportunity for it, then what we would do is I would just uh, grab the radio, let the A team know that we were in contact, right? And the A team would then attempt to line up air support, see if there were any helicopter gunships or ARAs, which were rocket firing helicopters. So, see if they were in the area, and we would call in air support to try and wipe out. I guess ideally wipe out whatever that unit was that we had run into. Well, I guess one of the worst ones was one time we were out with the Vietnamese company, and we got ambushed, and all the Vietnamese left. So there was myself, the other American I was with, and we had one Mountain Yard radio bearer that was with us. Right? And we were, kind of stuck there in the ambush, and the ambush was actually the top of almost like a low cliff. And so now, fortunately, at the end of the company, we had a platoon of Mountain Yards. It wasn't a full Vietnamese company. We had a platoon of Mountain Yards with us, and that platoon flanked and swept the ambush and got them out of there. Right. So, I mean, that was probably the most horrifying ambush that I was ever in, because you're stuck down there and you don't even have any guys around you to shoot back. So that was testy after that one. Guy I was with kept calling back to the A team to see if he and I to get extracted from there. And I said, they're not going to extract us. We're just going to end up walking around with this whole bunch of people for another couple of days. And, well, yeah, it matures you, I guess. Certainly makes everything that happens in life after that less severe. So, part of the job. You can't become fearful. Or you become fearful. When we were out in the camp, right? We were 10 Americans living in a remote camp, right? We lived in the inner perimeter of that camp, so we were more secure in that respect. But we were out there in the camp. I mean, we knew we had VC sympathizers in camp. We had VC spies, sometimes you get an intelligence report that you'd receive a message that said there was an intelligence report that said that we had an assassin in camp, right, that was out to kill Americans. So, all right, you know that, you find that out, but you can't stop functioning. You still have to, go about your job, and go about you being a human being, and eventually it all passes. Nobody ever got assassinated, but that that was just part of everyday living. We could have troops turn on us at any time and shot us all. The in terms of the larger war, which would be the Cold War, all right, the best description I've heard of it was that Vietnam was a very effective 18-year delaying action or holding action in the Cold War. And, you know, like it or not, there was some truth to what they used to refer to as the domino theory. That if one country falls, then it's more likely that another is going to fall. And what Vietnam did, and it was 18 years actually, because the first American I think was killed over there in '57, and the war lasted until '75, so it was an 18-year period. But what that holding action did was it kept other countries from falling under the wave of communism that was advancing. I mean, China and Russia both had objectives of the spread of communism and world domination of communism. Whether you believed in a domino theory or not, that was some of their real objectives. And some of the modern day evaluations of the Vietnam War is that it was very important, and that it kept those other countries such as Thailand, right, and in particular Indonesia, from falling under the influence of the Chinese communists. I don't know. They keep happening, so I guess they have to just, you know, be part of the human makeup. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's population control or anything like that. But you know that they happen, and you know, men generally end up involved in them, and I don't know if it's ever going to stop happening. So, a definition, it's difficult to come up with a definition. You can see somebody do something or hear of somebody doing something, and you recognize it as being heroism or being bravery, because what they did was out of the ordinary and they put their life at risk in doing that. So I guess you could say that's the definition of it. Yeah, I said for years that one of my biggest heroes of the Vietnam War was a helicopter pilot who one night I got a call or I picked up a call on the radio. Somebody down on Highway 19. They weren't any of our guys or anything. There were a couple guys from the 1st Cav who were going down Highway 19. They got ambushed, and it was a shame. It was a young kid that was calling. One of the 3 guys was killed. The other one was severely wounded, and then there was this 3rd guy who was on the radio, and he was just, you know, scared shitless, if you don't mind me recording that. And he was the guy I ended up talking. Our camp was the only thing that his radio contacted. You know, there wasn't anybody else around to pick it up. So I started trying to get a medevac in there, and it was late at night and dark, and it was very difficult to get helicopters to move during the night back during the Vietnam War. Now everybody has night vision and they can do all that stuff. But during Vietnam, there weren't that many helicopters that worked during the night. So I was trying to get somebody in there, and I tried and I tried and I tried, and I couldn't get a medevac in there. And And finally, I had a call came over the radio, and it was a section of ARA, which are ARAs were Huey helicopters, but they had about I don't know, about 60 rocket pods mounted to them, right? And we used to. And ARA stood for Aerial Rocket Artillery, and we used to refer to them as almost real artillery, right? But they were very effective when you called them in on a firefight or something like that. But anyway, this helicopter pilot told me and called me and told me he was with a section of ARA. And the section, I think, was either 3 or 4 ships. I'm not sure. And he just said to me, he said, if you give me a clean grid square where I can dump my ordnance, I'll go in and pick them up. So what that meant, and they were returning to Ankh from wherever they had been. And what he wanted was just give him a neutral piece of geography where he could go in and empty all his rockets into the mountainside. And because they couldn't go in armed, because if they went in there and there was an ambush, if the Viet Cong had ambushed a truck in hopes of getting a helicopter to come in and get it, and there was an ambush, then they were sitting ducks if they were sitting there with live rockets strapped all over that thing. So that's why he had to dump his ordnance. Right. So he went in and picked them up, took the guy back. But it took a couple of hours. But I always said that he was one of my heroes of Vietnam. I'd say that it was, I looked on it as being important and honorable. And it was quite an honor and a privilege to, at the age of 22 or 23, to be a member of what at the time was the most elite fighting force in the world, probably. So that's something that I've always been proud of. So.